I can finish it later. Well, let's see how the mountains are looking. The snow-capped peaks are starting to appear. Beautiful. You're here for part 2 of the Highlands of Multes? Seems our adventurers have already got themselves caught in some very curious circumstances. But then again, when in the Highlands of Multes, you never know what you are going to come across. Let's jump right into it. The old dusty tome here. Grab yourself a warm cup of hot chocolate and perhaps a nice fluffy pillow and a cozy chair. I give you part 2. I guess we don't need to snap the candles on, it's daytime. But it would make a nice ambiance now, wouldn't it? I give you part 2 of the Highlands of Multes. Alright. Let's see where we are. Looks like our adventurers got caught up in some snowy trees, turned out to be harmless. Took a little ride in the mouth of a giant eel. And now stand before Midneer Lake with 2 tall black shapes walking right towards them. The party of 4 peered through the frosty haze at the black humanoid figures that were steadily growing closer. The party could now see that they were wielding weapons. One, a long, curving, terrible-looking blade, and the other, a 2-handed flail big enough for a hill giant. They were armor-clad, head to toe, in tar black harnesses and wore fanged bassinets, which made it appear as though they had black mouths in place of faces.
You don't suppose they're here on friendly terms, do you, Valentine?
Asked Ubi.
They're not,
replied the paladin grimly. Ubi was the first to valiantly step forth, unleashing a prestidigitation spell which took the form of a deflating balloon, did little more than sail over the heads of the Dread Knights. He quickly retreated in fear from the front lines. Before long, the party was wrapped in a most bone-chilling combat. Val charged forth to meet the great whirling flail which seemed to fracture the air with each swing. The warlock Retribution's eyes immolated with a smoldering fury, and she and the witch Raya emitted a storm of eldritch blasts and twisting witch bolts respectively into the enemies, while Valenrad kept them well at bay. It was a textbook engagement. Before long, the unrelenting barrage of the warlock and the witch had utterly pounded their cold, dark nemeses into the ground. The Dread Knights lay motionless, contrasted in the fresh white powder, as once more the whistling winds dominated the airwaves. Though he did feel great aching pain from the melee, Valenrad's shining armor had shined upon him that day, as he had no major wounds.
Here, a little mending spell I learned during my many years spent in the Tandine woodlands. I hope you feel better.
Thank you, Raya.
Ubi approached the flail to pick it up, but quickly dropped it from the weight.
I'll just drag it along on our way home.
Valenrad retrieved a strange-looking insignia from the shoulder of one of the knights, 2 grinning, lipless jaws devouring a crimson eye. The young paladin became as still as the corpses before him.
What's wrong?
Spoke Raya. The paladin rose to his feet and pocketed the insignia.
Let's continue on, lest we freeze to death in this wasteland.
The party carefully traversed the frozen lake and eventually made it safely to the caved mound on the island. They descended down, and through they went, until the walls started to sprout with crystals. Suddenly, Ubi felt himself cascading down a slippery chute to the right of them. He slid until the party could no longer hear his pronounced whirring.
Ubi! Are you okay?
Shouted Raya.
What can you see?
A long silence proceeded, but soon came the gnome's response.
You'll have to see for yourself. Come down here.
The party carefully but quickly trotted down the main route of the cave until they came to a most spectacular spectacle. On the edge of an underground lake they beheld mighty vaulted ceilings, all dazzlingly crystalline and stretching far beyond.
Over here!
Came a familiar voice. The party turned to their right to find the little gnome standing in an alcove by the shore, and with no apparent way to reach him.
I hope you all can swim.
Spoke Retribution.
You might want to remove your armor, Paladin.
Valret, look!
Hollered Raya to their left. She was playing with a sea snail docked at the shore bank. But this was no ordinary sea snail. It was roughly the size of a wheelbarrow, and its shell dazzled with colors of blue and red and purple. It wasn't long before another one of the snails swam from in the cave to dock beside its kin and demand some attention of its own.
They seem nice. I bet they'd be willing to ferry us to Ubi,
suggested Raya. Valenrad sighed.
First giant eels, now snails, it seems. You first, Raya.
The party climbed aboard the snails, Raya and Retribution on one, and Val on the other, and were soon off sailing through the glassy subterranean waters and gazing up at the ceiling, whose majesty became ever more breathtaking the deeper they went. More shimmering snails could be seen sailing over the waters. What odd creatures they were, their feet churning through the water, creating wakes like little tugboats. They finally reached Ubi at the alcove.
Come on, take a look inside.
He uttered and ushered them forth with a fluttering of his hands. They entered a very small room coated with crystals of numerous shapes and colors like a many-bottled northern lights. Ubi withdrew the painting of the cephalic crystal that the great Archmage Thurset had done for them.
Well then, does anybody see a wide, clear crystal with a smooth tip?
Raya found and pulled a similar-looking crystal to the description, but upon dislodging it, it exploded in a plume of toxic vapors that tore at the lungs like glass. A terrible mist soon filled the entire room, and the party was forced to leave.
Let's get out of here. There has to be another alcove like this one.
Spoke Valenrad. They departed and sailed until they found a similar-looking cove, ran their snails ashore, and stepped inside.
Hey, how about this one?
Spoke Raya.
Wide, clear, with a smooth tip? This is absolutely it.
She tugged on a long crystalline protrusion, only to discover that it was the nose of some sort of icy gargoyle-like creature. Out came its head, and it batted her violently to the ground with a squawk. But as soon as Valenrad had drawn his mace and Retribution ready to spell, it had already flown out of the cave and up into the vaulted ceiling beyond.
Hopefully that's the last we see of that unsavory fellow.
Let's check some more crystals. But this time, be careful, everyone.
Cautioned Retribution. Despite the cold, the party carefully inspected every crystal in its entirety. Finally, Ubi came across one that was wide and clear with a smooth tip, and it didn't seem to be attached to any body either. He hovered his hand over it, and it radiated a soft, whispering light.
Friends, by golly, I think we've found it.
Exclaimed Ubi. They each peered over Ubi's shoulder as he grabbed hold of it. It sung as he pulled it cleanly and easily out of the wall. The crystal matched the description perfectly, and it gave off an aura that made all of them feel giddy and joyful for no reason.
Well done, Ubi.
Indeed. Now let's get out of this cave before we all freeze to death.
Implored Retribution, whose hair had near completely frozen over. They sailed over the lake. Upon arriving back on the shore, Ubi found himself stumbling into a shallow pit in the ground. He regained his composure, and soon discovered that he had just stepped into a deep footprint nearly 5 times the size of his own foot. He found another right beside it, and another. A trail of footprints leading only 20 feet away, where loomed a snow-white giant. Drool coated its fangs.
Yeti!
Screamed Ubi, but his scream was quickly consumed by the harrowing howl of the behemoth. It charged him with lightning-fast speed and mauled with a heavy paw, sending him like a rag doll up into the air and into the glittering lake. He quickly crawled out of the water and gazed up to see the Yeti careening towards him. It was Valenrad who stepped between them to take several punishing swipes, most of which battered into his shield. Retribution put a hex on the Yeti and began burning it with beams of eldritch energy.
Take this!
Shouted Raya, running up behind the beast. She whipped her hand in circles until a cloud of toxic vapors formed. She blew the cloud of poison onto her foe. It thrashed at the air and then turned around and unleashed a guttural gale of its own, freezing completely both her and Retribution behind her. Valenrad was left alone, swinging furiously at the beast. Ubi, still holding the cephalic crystal, raised up a shaking hand. The crystal began to ring, and purple and pink nether began to swirl in his hand like a dense amalgamation of incandescent stars. As Valenrad and the Yeti weaved in a vicious melee, Ubi did his best to keep his trembling hand trained on the howling behemoth. The last thing Ubi recalled from the mayhem was a blinding flash of ultraviolet light and a deafening ringing. And then there came the distant rushing of winter air, and the gentle wind through oak trees singing their leaves, and the chirping of birds just outside as his head lay on a soft, feathery pillow.
I feel as though I've escaped time itself. Where am I?
Why, you're in my red tower. Do you not recognize it?
Ubi opened his eyes and gazed around the bedroom, generously decorated with linens and tapestries of red and green and yellow. The walls glittered in multicolored prismatic patterns cast by the many different stained glass windows adorning the walls. He recognized the high bedchamberer and the voice of his mentor. He was a thin man with a long hazel beard dressed in violet velvet. His eyes cut with an otherworldly concentration at all times, but his rosy cheeks nonetheless disarmed the stern focus of the great Archmage Thurset.
Thurset, I don't remember a darn thing of the trip home. And that fiasco with the Yeti.
Seems you ended the fight with quite a powerful magic missile. I told you cephalic crystals were potent.
Ubi caught a hazy glimpse of the giant black flail lying on the table behind his master.
I made sure we brought it back for you, Ubi.
Spoke Raya, kneeling beside him. Ubi soon realized that he was surrounded by each of his former companions.
And it must have belonged to a most treacherous character. You've all certainly overcome tremendous odds. We also found this,
spoke Valenrad, his wavy dark hair now flowing freely.
It was on the very person who wielded this mighty flail. Do you recognize it?
He withdrew the sigil of the lipless fangs, devouring a blood-red, lidless eye. The great Archmage Thurset stared at it unblinking. His jaw hung wide, and it seemed as though something had stolen his breath entirely. Ubi recoiled in his sheets. He had never seen true fear in his master's eyes. And there we have it. The end of the trek through the Highlands of Multes. And what was it? This fear that Ubi and his companions saw in Archmage Thurset's eyes. Perhaps only myself and other sorcerers of a similar power and seers could know. But perhaps Ubi and his friends will figure it out in time. I think very soon. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day, my friends.